Treasury Select Committee on Tuesday the 14th of October 2025. We're here today to start our sessions to discuss the options available to the Chancellor of the Exchequer at her forthcoming budget on the 26th of November, and we're delighted to have a highly expert panel today to talk about the challenges that she faces and the options that might be available to her. So from my left to right, we have Helen Miller, who's Director at the Institute for Fiscal Studies, which of course came out with some thoughts on this very issue only yesterday. Dan Needle, who's the founder of Tax Policy Associates, having spent a career in tax law as a tax lawyer. And he's been out on the media recently as well. In fact, all of you have really, so you've all got views on the record, and we're hoping to tease those out today. Ruth Curtis is the Chief Executive of the Resolution Foundation. Her predecessors seem to be filling number 10 rather rapidly at the moment, so I'm not sure how long Ruth is for the role, but she joined the Resolution Foundation from His Majesty's Treasury. And Professor Arun Advani, who is the Professor of Economics at the University of Warwick, and has obviously had made lots of interventions on issues, including on wealth taxes. So we're really keen to hear from you. I thought it'd be just good to start off really with, we've got a very challenging fiscal situation, which I think everyone would acknowledge. The Chancellor's got to come up with her budget by the 26th of November. Time is ticking on. There's a potential gap of 20 to 40 billion, depending who you read and which way the wind is blowing on a particular day. So if I could say from left to right, starting with Helen Miller, if you were in her shoes, what would be the top 2 or 3 things that you'd be looking to do to try and manage the fiscal situation?
Yeah. So obviously I'm not going to tell you exactly what I would do in the sense that it's a political choice, and I think it's important to emphasise that there really are trade-offs here, and it was a political decision what to do. I think she's going to face a couple of big judgments. So one is, you mentioned there's an uncertainty about the size of this gap. That's basically there's uncertainty about the size of the borrowing downgrade. She'll have to choose what to do about that. I think most of us think that she will stick to her fiscal rules. I think that's the right choice to make. But even then, she'll have a choice over to whether to just about meet those fiscal rules with some tiny headroom, or whether to go further. So there's a choice about the size of the fiscal consolidation she wants to make. Then there's a choice about how to spread that between tax rises and spending cuts. Again, there's a choice there. And then if you're going to do tax rises, there's a choice about which ones to raise. What we highlighted yesterday is that I think there'll be a lot of focus in coming weeks on the politics of any tax rises, and in particular on the extent to which she could raise more revenue without breaking her big pledges around income tax, NICs and VAT. You could raise tens of billions of pounds without touching those taxes. It would be hard, just mechanically, because they're the big taxes, they're a tax on a big base. But look, you could scrape 20, 30 billion without touching those taxes. The question is not could you, I think it's should you. And I think what we're urging is, as well as thinking about the politics of any choice, obviously important, thinking about the economics too. I mean, tax rises are not all born equal. Some are much more damaging than others to things we care about, like welfare and growth. So I think really it's those things you're weighing up. And I think the final plea I'd have is whatever Rachel Reeves decides to do, I think there's a huge opportunity here to reform taxes to mean that they are doing less damage to economic growth. So I think if all Rachel Reeves does is just raises revenue, I think they'll be missing the opportunity to do something more substantive that means you could reduce the cost of that revenue at the same time. Now, I'm happy to go through any number of examples of that, but I think that's they're the 3 choices she really faces, and that's the opportunity I think she has.
Well, thank you for that, and we want to get into detail on some of what the potential options are as we go through. So, Dan Needle.
I think I agree with Helen. To the extent that she decides she has to raise tax, there are essentially 2 ways to do it. One is by raising one of the main taxes, perhaps a breach of a manifesto pledge, possibly by expanding the base of VAT, and we can talk about that later, which may or may not breach a manifesto pledge. I'm not a philosopher, I can't speak to that. I think that would be the wise way to do it. The less wise way to do it is by picking from a Scrabble bag of lots of little individual tax rises. The reason why that would be suboptimal is we have had 30 years of minute changes here and there to the tax system. Over that time, the tax system has become more and more complex, accumulated more and more anomalies, political compromises, which get baked in. And every time you create 10 more tiny tax rises, tax changes, you're adding to that layer, which has ossified our tax system. So I very much hope she does not do that. I would hope that as well as addressing the immediate fiscal issues, she steps back and thinks about ways that you could reform the tax system to be pro-growth, which we have rarely seen in the last few decades, but now I think has become quite desperate. And again, maybe we can talk about that later.
We'll get on to that. Ruth Curtis.
Thanks. So at the Resolution Foundation, we focus on living standards, and with that in mind, I would go a bit further than Dan and Helen. I would say, looking at things in the round, she should raise taxes at this budget. When you look at the cost of borrowing for the UK relative to other countries, it's one of the highest of rich countries, and the position that we face, there is a strong case for raising taxes at this budget, and of course that is partly in light of the decisions already taken on spending, which we can go through. So with that in mind, and in order to do that, I would have three things, some of which chime. One is the sort of specific economic situation in which we find ourselves, which is low growth and sticky inflation, and therefore things which minimise the tax rises, which minimise the impact on growth, but also minimise the impact on inflation, I think is important for this budget. I would make them in a way that improves the tax system, moves it towards a better system rather than away from it, and Dan and Helen have talked about that. I think it's not just politics, and we should think about how the distribution of the pain of tax rises fits with the fact that we have only just emerged, barely emerged from a cost of living crisis, and therefore we should think carefully about the winners and losers. And we've set out some specific proposals that we think fit with that: reducing employee national insurance while increasing income tax, changes to capital gains tax, introducing a tax on the salt and sugar content of processed food, and many more. So happy to go into those as we go through the session.
Dipping through the Scrabble bag, as Mr. Needle put it.
They're not a Scrabble bag, but we can come back to that.
Professor Advani.
Thanks. So I would agree with a lot of what's been said so far. I mean, I think certainly to echo right from the start what Helen said, which is there's an overall question of tax and spend, and I wouldn't want to get into something like that political choice. But in a world in which the spending side is fixed, then tax rises are the only option at that stage. In that case, I think
you're saying because the spending is fixed because of the spending
review? Spending review is done.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a choice about whether something's going to be done on the welfare side. I mean, and other annually managed spending that hasn't happened, at least so far. So if we think of that as fixed, and for today we're thinking about tax, then I would say that actually, in some sense, it's a really good thing that the Labour Party, when it was in opposition and was coming into, was pushing for power, said that it was going to not change the rates of the big taxes. The many problems in our tax system are out there and desperate to be fixed. I mean, many of us have written about these things before and talked about them before. And it's a really good thing if they think of those levers as being removed from something they can mess with at the moment, because if you want to raise taxes at the moment, there are plenty of ways to do it that would actually improve the tax system. And Dan might describe some of that as a Scrabble bag, but actually I would say it is a Scrabble bag in the sense of there are many, many places where we've made a change to one part of the system and not others, and that treats otherwise equal behaviours differently. That creates complexity, that creates scope for avoidance, that is actually very bad for economic efficiency and growth. And fixing those things actually would raise money. Again, if in the world in which we decide we want to raise money, would raise money while making the tax system better. And I think those are really the kinds of things that we should be focused on. That actually doesn't require going to the big taxes in terms of the rates. It does, in some cases, require thinking at the base of something like national insurance or a VAT. But it wouldn't be about changing rates. It would be about trying to broaden those bases, trying to fix places where there are gaps so that otherwise similar behaviours are treated more similarly. And that would be much, much better.
The two of you particularly highlighted tax and growth. So, Dan Needle, you said you could reform the tax system to make it grow. Some of these changes have made it difficult. If you were sitting at the Chancellor's shoulder advising her about how to change things to encourage growth, which two or three things would you push her to think about?
Start with corporation tax. The UK's corporation tax system is rated by the US Tax Foundation as one of the least competitive in the world, less competitive than Sweden, Italy, Greece. And those are countries with higher rates of corporate tax than us. The reason is complexity. Italy used to be a laughingstock for the uncertainty of its tax system. They had a major series of reforms about 10 years ago. We just haven't. We've layered complexity upon complexity. The Chancellor could take a radically different approach to simplification. Instead of an essentially technical body like the Office for Tax Simplification, which produced extremely, I think, worthy and excellent reports, but most of them were never implemented. You need a political commitment to simplification, a small body of smart people with a junior minister responsible whose job was to identify areas in the tax code where you can eliminate a whole series of rules and legislation without a net fiscal consequence. And I believe there are many like that. I should say I'm not applying for a job.
I was going to say, it
sounded
me. Like a job
absolutely not me, but it could and should be done, and I think it would be welcomed by business. So that's the first thing. The second thing, more politically difficult, is VAT. There is a chart that shows the level of turnover of businesses and the number of businesses at that level of turnover. What you'd expect to see is lots of micro businesses, a few large businesses, and then a smooth curve from one to the other. You don't see that at all. What you see is a big jump just before the VAT registration threshold, now £90,000, as businesses cluster before that threshold, and then a cliff edge after that. I used to assume that was people evading tax, not declaring, but there's some compelling research suggesting that it is not that. Businesses deliberately hold back their growth. Plumbers don't take on an apprentice. Contractors go away in February. People deliberately avoid hitting that threshold because as soon as they hit it, they lose 20% or they become uncompetitive. Why do we have a tax system which stops small businesses growing? There's two answers to that. One answer is to increase the threshold. That's a bad idea, partly because it's expensive, partly because you're then stopping larger businesses from growing, and that's more economically damaging. The real answer is to reduce the threshold and to aim for it to fall to a similar level to the rest of Europe, so about the level where you can't actually be much more than a hobby business and be under the threshold. The small business lobby is very much against that. I'm not sure that represents their members. If you speak to small businesses, the issue for them is becoming uncompetitive. If a plumber's fees suddenly go up by 20% more than their rivals, that's a big problem. But if everyone is operating in the same environment, things are different. So I wish the government would look at ways to reduce the threshold, and I suspect that politically that would have to be done on a cost-neutral basis. You'd say, okay, we are reducing the threshold, but we are using the revenue to reduce the rate, it wouldn't be very much, maybe just 0.5%, possibly as much as 1%, and that perhaps makes it doable.
Because obviously consumers will be paying more.
Yes, consumers will be paying more, so I think to sell that you need to say overall this is being done because it's good for growth. So VAT, if I can quickly say the third thing, another similar cliff edge problem in the tax system is the very, very high tax rates, people earning £60,000 and £100,000. At £100,000, the official rate, because of the withdrawal of personal allowance, is 62%. Now, I know plenty of people, who think we should have a top rate of 62%. I don't agree, but it's a view you can rationally hold. But I don't know anyone who rationally thinks we should have a top rate of 62% between £100,000 and £125,000, and then a top rate of 47% after that. It's not rational. That's the system we have. And that's the best case result, because if you take up the government's childcare subsidies, you lose all of it at £100,000. For, say, a consultant, a doctor working in London, that can mean a cash loss of £20,000 when your income hits the £100,000 point. Now, some people look at this and say, why should we care about people earning £100,000? Well, I look at the emails I receive from hospital managers telling me that they cannot get consultants to work 5 days a week because it would cost them more money. Or I get emails from IT contractors saying that they turn away work for the same reason. So the question is, this is clearly having an impact on the NHS, on the economy. How big an impact is that? I'd very much hope someone in the Treasury is looking at that. And if it is a material impact, then real thought should be given to how we can iron out those discontinuities in the tax system and do so in a way which doesn't net cost tax.
Thank you. Professor Advani, you mentioned.
I definitely agree with all of those. There are plenty more. I mean, so just at a high level, it's worth saying that the way to get growth from the tax system is not trying to pick off individual bits of legislation that you can carve away and work out which exact rules you can remove. It's about changing the structure of the tax system so we don't need those rules. So, I would agree with all of the examples Dan gave, and I would have given all of those. A couple more that you could look at. One place where the tax system isn't encouraging growth is that you have a lower rate of tax if you invest by buying a property compared to if you invest by buying shares. If you're buying shares, you're taxed at the dividend tax rate after corporation tax has already been paid by the company. That's a higher rate than if you buy property. It's not clear why we think investment in property should be privileged over other kinds of investment. Another example is if you work as an employee, you're taxed at a higher rate through income tax, national insurance contributions that are employer national insurance contributions and employee contributions. That's a higher rate than you would pay if you were working as a partner. That encourages organisations that are typically in the service industries to form partnership structures rather than incorporated structures. And that might sound like arcane backroom stuff that we don't need to care about, but actually in a partnership structure, among other things, it's much harder to hold investments because the investments need to be held by the partners individually rather than by the partnership. Partnerships aren't able to hold them directly without some complexity. And those sorts of things, again, get in the way of investment. So it's this kind of structural simplification that's needed to get rid of those differences in rates so that people would make the choices that are the ones that are the right choices to make economically rather than making them just for tax reasons.
Okay, I'm just going to bring John Glenn in.
Yeah, I think you all make very clear intellectual arguments on what you could do in theory. Politicians, government ministers have got to make decisions of what happens in practice. And as Ruth will know, having been 15 years in the Treasury, faces ministers who have to make those decisions based on what is actually going to be scored. So I'd just like to ask Dan...
So we say scored by the Office of Budget
Scored by the Office of Budget Responsibility. This isn't an intellectual exercise of academics. It's actually having to operationalise it in a way that meets that test that the OBR essentially states. Dan, if I could just ask you about, you set out very clear examples there, but what analysis have you or any of you done on the actual behavioural effects of some of those changes? So for example, you talk about reducing the VAT by a very small percentage. Is there any quantification of the impact on growth or on any of those measures that you've said? Because it's a compelling critique, but what is the outcome, and have you any sense of what the OBR or other independent respected people would say about it?
Fair question. Oddly, I'm not aware of any macroeconomic modelling that's been done on the VAT or the income tax cliff edges. We can count the number of companies who are caught within that, and it's about 38,000, that's probably more now, about 45,000 now. Income tax, I think Professor Advani was looking at counting the number, but it's a sizable number. But what the effect is, it seems like an important question, but my expertise is not that, so no, I can't answer you.
Professor Advani, do you want anything you want to say?
There are, as we said, there's lots of different of these examples. Some of them that are easier to work out how to score. So something like what the impact is of the income tax cliff edge. We're actually working on this at the moment, and so I can't actually tell you the numbers because we have this process by which we get access to the data. So I can't tell you the numbers yet until they're cleared. But we're working on kind of the size of that gap and basically where you think what incomes would be already and what the impact of that is ultimately on labour supply. Because if you think about people, the examples Dan gave of somebody stepping out from work or reducing their hours, that's not just the impact it has on them now, it's the impact it has on them across their career. And so we're looking at those kinds of things.
But you're looking at including pensions and stuff.
Exactly. Another thing that you can think about how you would score, like there's a process the Treasury would have for scoring already is Treasury already in its modelling where it uses multipliers is thinking out what the cost of capital is in there. Some of these things like what's happening on corporate tax, also examples that I haven't yet given around the way that capital gains tax is structured, are things that effectively increase the cost of capital to people investing. There is a way, the Treasury already has a process by which it would include that, and so if you think about what's the change in the cost of capital if you were to make this change, that's something that would go through a Treasury model, and I think the OBR would accept that in that it's a fairly standard existing model that the Treasury uses for doing that.
And a woman who was at the Treasury, Ruth Curtis.
Well, I think it's just worth distinguishing between two things that the OBR do. One is score the behavioural effects of tax changes. They've done that for a long time. The Treasury did that before the existence of the OBR. As Aaron says, there are assumptions about the elasticity of behaviour to tax rates that are well established. Some of these changes would be more novel and harder to estimate, but nothing about the OBR process would stop the Treasury doing that, and the Treasury and the OBR would come to a view about how much tax revenue to score, as they always have. There is a separate question which has got a lot of attention recently, which is where policies have an effect on the supply side of the economy, what do the OBR estimate as the ultimate kind of growth benefit of that? That is a newer area and where the OBR rightly have quite a high threshold for scoring. But I suppose it doesn't stop you doing the tax change and scoring the revenue. It makes it uncertain, because it is uncertain what the ultimate kind of medium-term effect on GDP might be.
Anna Miller, anything to add?
I just sort of underline the point that, I don't think we should ever expect to see that there is a set of estimates for every possible policy combination you could do, because there are just thousands and thousands of them. But we do have a growing body of evidence that, Arun and 9 others are contributing to. So, for example, I've done lots of work on the capital gains treatment of small businesses, showing that actually, we've got the evidence on this now, showing that upfront reliefs have a much bigger effect on investment than capital gains tax breaks do. So we have lots of evidence there. So there is growing evidence. I think stepping back, what I'd say is that we shouldn't be over-obsessed with what the OBR will put in the second thing that Ruth talked about, in that supply-side model. We know that the tax system is treating lots of similar activities in lots of different ways. That is that is gumming up the allocation of resources, whether it's people or capital or housing. That is bad for growth. And I think there's a danger that we wait to find the one lever that has a big effect on the OBR. It doesn't exist. If we knew it, we would have pulled it, right? We're going to have to do the hard yards across lots of policy areas, across lots of areas of tax, and you do enough of them, you get resources reallocating, then you get productivity growth. So I think if we just only wait for the thing that will have the OBR forecast tipping up, we're never going to get there. So I think it's about, we have lots of evidence, a body of theoretical and empirical evidence about the very many ways in which tax is holding back growth. And I think on that evidence base, I think we can be confident that if we did enough of that, it would move the dial, even if you can't have it in the 5-year forecast in year 5 very quickly.
Thank you. Quick question from John Grady.
So just to sum up, and simplicity in Scrabble gives you 19 and growth gives you 13, by the way, Mr. Needle. Just to sum up this chapter of evidence, what you're all saying is it's very clear that we've got an overly complex tax code, and if we simplified it and did the hard yards of simplifying it properly, that will give us more growth and really help to get us out of this economic peril.
We're saying there's two types of simplification. One is structural simplification, where you look at ways the taxes to economically similar things in radically different ways, and that's more powerful as a pro-growth engine, but more politically controversial because you're going to have losers. The other is technical simplification, which won't have losers and is easier, but less dramatic in terms of its growth effects. Much less dramatic.
Thank you. Bobby Dean, MP.
Yeah, we're going to be talking a lot about tax today, but we thought it would also be useful to just maybe look at alternatives to tax briefly as well. So whether or not there is any realistic chance of us getting big boosts to productivity or seeing large amount of spending cuts. There's obviously lots of ideas out there about whether or not we can cut the welfare bill, shrink the size of the civil service, or maybe we can do stuff with youth unemployment. I mean, perhaps Helen Miller, you want to come in first of all. Are there any big opportunities for the Chancellor in terms of productivity or spending cuts in this budget?
Yeah, so let me say a couple of things on that. I think, again, I think we're thinking about wanting to drive up productivity, which I think really should be the defining thing we're all thinking about. You've got to think not just about what you can cut, right? It's kind of the equivalent of on the tax side. It's about what you can reform. So you think about just a couple of examples where there's big spending pressures on disability and on special educational needs and disabilities for children. They're areas where, yes, you could just cut them. Maybe you couldn't politically, but in principle, there's no reason why you couldn't just cut those entitlements. You'd save some money. Is that going to have a productivity effect? Well, not necessarily, right? You want to think about, for disability, for example, how can you help support more people back into the workforce? With special educational needs, how do you support those children to make sure that they have a pathway into adulthood that includes them being part of the workforce, for example? So I think we need to think not just about could you just slash the funding, but could you reform areas of spending in ways that would ultimately mean that we have more resources being used productively? That's what we're really thinking about. So one challenge is just to think about reform, and if some reforms may lead to either direct spending, savings, or kind of good things in the future. The other thing I'd mention is, I think what's really important about what the Chancellor chooses in the upcoming budget is that it's credible to the people who are lending the government money. So the government, this is not a great time to be borrowing in the world for reasons I'm very happy to discuss, but lots of governments are trying to borrow lots of money, borrowing rates are high, our interest rate bill would be the second biggest department if it were a department. This is not a great time to be trying to borrow lots of money. And even small changes in the interest rate at which we borrow have big effects on our interest rate bill. So I think the more you can signal to the people who are investing in the country that it's a credible pathway, then I think the more that could have some payoffs in terms of lower interest rate bills, and that could be good. And again, that doesn't just mean cut spending. I think, again, if the government could show that there are some areas where reform is needed and has a credible plan about how to get those reforms happening in a way it could get through Parliament, that could be a good signal. So there's a kind of a channel there through signalling to investors that you have a plan that tackles with some of the big spending increase coming down the track. I'll just mention in passing, the same's true on the tax side. So things like the disappearance of fuel duty revenue, and there's no plan for that. Having a plan for that, whatever the revenue you thought was going to outcome was going to be, that credibility, I think, could have a payoff in terms of people lending to us.
Could I just push on one point in relation to that? Because we know that when we sort of speculate about potential productivity gains that could be earned from activities like the ones you've just described, the OBR tend to not score them very strongly because there's a lot of uncertainty to it. But at the same time, the sorts of reforms that you're talking about, I guess, would cost money, because you're probably talking about support programs for people, or a greater number of people to support children with SEND in schools and so on. Are you saying that the lenders to the government might tolerate a plan which actually increases spending if they feel like there might be hopes of productivity at the end of it, or do you think they need to find that money from elsewhere?
There's a couple of different things there. So I think how the market responds will depend on what they think of the plan, whether it just feels like a giveaway or whether it feels like an investment in the future. There are fiscal rules. We are hitting up against them. Yeah. I think if Rachel Reeves decides to just break those, and I don't think this is going to happen, but if she decided to say, actually, I'm going to break my fiscal rule, I'm going to borrow more money to spend on stuff, I think that would, having emphasised so strongly that they are ironclad, I think that would go down like a lead brick, honestly. So I do think there is this constraint that she has put on herself. And it's not that we wouldn't be able to borrow money after that point. I mean, I'm not, you know...
It just gets more expensive.
It just gets more expensive. It's about what price, the price at which you borrow it. But these are the trade-offs we have, right? It's about where you want to spend your money. Remember, we're already spending quite a lot of money as well. So it's about how you allocate those funds and how you tackle some of these areas where spending is rising.
Ruth Chris, I didn't know if you wanted to come in on this point.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think on productivity, it's just worth zooming out, right? So the OBR forecast at the moment assumes productivity growth of about 1.25%. That is based on the average the decade before the financial crisis and the average the decade after. So it assumes we get some pre-financial crisis vim and vigour back in the economy, and we haven't seen that. Since the pandemic, productivity is almost flat. So, as in we've almost seen no productivity growth. So should the government do absolutely everything it can to get productivity up again? Yes. Does it seem reasonable that that will get it above and beyond the 1.25% that the OBR are already assuming? To me, no. So the problem on productivity is very, very deep, and that means we need to do everything we can, but I'm not sure that a credible forecast scores on top of an already kind of optimistic baseline, and we'll see what they do in the autumn, more and more measures. And I think to Helen's point about the kind of how the markets would take that, we need to be realistic about where we might end up on productivity. And then just on spending, I think it's worth kind of remembering where the spending review landed, which was about over those 3 years, 1.2% real growth in spending. That is definitely not austerity, but it's pretty much the tightest spending review outside of the period of austerity. Most of that additional money went to the NHS. So I think politicians need to square up to the choice has effectively become whether that money should go into the NHS or whether taxes should go up. And that is kind of quite a square choice that we face as a country.
Thank you very much. And Chris Coughlin.
Thank you. Helen Miller, I could just come back to your earlier statement about, I think you said if spending's stuck, then that leaves tax rises. But on this whole debate on productivity, there's been a huge body of economic research in recent years about how innovative technology can drive productivity. There's just been a Nobel Prize in economics awarded for that. Yet the OBR still treats productivity as exogenous to growth. Draghi called in his speech to the EU a couple of weeks ago for the EU to focus on public research and development to drive economic growth. Surely that should be a way. And Draghi also said that if the EU borrowed for public research and development, that would actually lower the debt to GDP ratio if that was driving growth. So surely there is a third option there.
Yeah. So look, the government already spends. We do spend money on public research and development, and we have a bunch of bits of the tax system, for example, R&D tax credits, that is aiming to drive up innovation. I mean, look, you're right in the sense that, in the long run, and I'm simplifying a bit, but in the long run, what can you do to get the economy growing? You either have to just reallocate resources in a more efficient way, so people are better matched to where they're most productive, or you have to have some kind of technological innovation, which means that for a given amount of input, you can do more stuff. They are basically the two routes to going for growth. And what we've talked about with the tax system is that the tax system is currently stopping that allocation, and that's one of the things you could do, help the allocation, that would drive up productivity. You're right, we should also be thinking about driving up technological innovation. Could the government borrow more for R&D? Well, look, it is borrowing quite a lot more for the big increase in investment. I mean, people think about last year's budget as being this fiscal tightening because they saw the tax increase. It was a big fiscal loosening. The government did a big increase in borrowing. And if you look at where some of that money was spent, it wasn't only spent on the things that you might think are directly targeted at growth, transport or the science department or whatever. A lot of it went on to defence and to net zero, some of which will be R&D and some of which will be the kind of spending you're talking about. But I think that speaks to there is a constraint at some point on how much we can borrow or at what cost. And the government has made choices about how to prioritise defence spending versus public R&D or versus other things. And I think that's a choice we face. And if you only cared about growth, then I think there is and that is a caveat that's important in what I've just said. If you only cared about growth, then I think you would put, for any given amount of money you were spending, put more of it into the R&D or science bucket. Of course, the real preference of the government is that it's not what they care about. They also care about defence and other things. So look, I think defence spending, I think R&D spending can be a way to get growth. But again, we shouldn't be thinking that we just need to have tons and tons and tons of that, right? I mean, I expect there is a positive return to R&D, but it's not just about the government doing it itself, it's about how it incentivises the broader network. And thinking about one of the things Dan said earlier about the corporation tax system, bring it back to tax, it also matters that the private sector wants to invest. And for any given level of incentive, just the uncertainty around investment also is going to hold back investment. So again, all these things are interrelated, right? There's not just one put some more money in something. I think it's how the whole system is interacting together to create the incentives to do things, including investment in innovation.
Thank you. And sorry, just to push back, a lot of the increase in defence spending is actually on R&D. But if a lot of the issue right now is the OBR potentially downgrading productivity forecasts and therefore increasing the fiscal black hole, surely if the government successfully argues that it can defer some of these productivity decreases, then that is going to reduce the fiscal black hole right now.
Yes, if it can, this is kind of to Ruth's point, if it can find things that that the OBR is confident enough will push productivity up, and that's important. That's not the OBR being a meanie. I think we have to be careful that we do need some kind of confidence in order to put it in the forecast. And there'll be plenty of things here that are good to do and we should do, but won't be big enough. They won't be material enough to move the OBR forecast. Doesn't mean you shouldn't do them. I think we are getting hung up on this particular forecast for a 5-year window. There are some things that are good to do. We should do them because you do enough of them, and in the long run, we'll be better off. And that's what we really care about. But yes, if the government can do some things that basically show up positively in the supply side of the economy, that will make life easier. But I think that's not an easy thing to do in a 5-year window. I think we should be realistic about what the government can actually do that would have returns in 5 years that are material enough to push up on that productivity enough. But yes, in mind we should have the ultimate goal is to get the economy to be more productive. That's the kind of the true way out of all the difficulties we're going to face.
And Ruth, sorry, did you have any comments on that? And also related, R&D spend overall for the government isn't actually materially rising. So how can we expect them to improve productivity?
So on the first point, I guess the problem is not, the problem facing the public finances is not that the OBR may make a judgment 0.1 or 0.2 one way or the other. The problem is that the economy has been unproductive since 2008. And I think that is the reality that is coming home to roost, and that's also been the problem for living standards and for families, not just for the tax take. And I guess when we think about should we just borrow a bit more for R&D spending and will that help? We also need to think about where is the UK's fiscal position overall. Are there reasons to think that we should, on balance, run a tighter or a looser fiscal position? And we've talked about the cost of borrowing, but when you also think about the future, we have an ageing population. We know that health spending tends to grow as a proportion of the economy for other reasons. It seems to me unlikely that the mistake we're about to make is to borrow too little rather than to borrow too much. And so I think every marginal case you can kind of make needs to be set in that context.
Mr. Needle.
It's possible that we could improve R&D by spending less on R&D. I'm thinking specifically about R&D tax relief, the corporation tax, which costs about £8 billion a year. The rules for it are bizarre. It's worth taking a look at quite how bizarre. It's not statute so much. It's a statutory reference to guidance by the Department for Business and Enterprise, as was. It's very vague. That vagueness means that in the last 15 years, about £10 billion has been lost to fraudulent and incorrect R&D tax credit claims, none of which will have done anything to boost R&D. Today, HMRC has rather clamped down. The effect of that is that if you want to claim R&D tax relief, you have quite a tough task. That uncertainty means that R&D tax relief is not an incentive, because you would be extremely optimistic in all but the clearest case to assume that, we're starting this project, we'll benefit from R&D tax relief. Instead, it's something that's claimed after the event. It's not an incentive. Government has been trapped by the current system. There's about 50,000 claims a year for R&D tax relief. You can't have a pre-clearance process for 50,000 claims. What could happen is a radical reshaping of that. Instead of 8 billion, it could be 5 billion, 4 billion, 3 billion, it doesn't matter. You narrow it so that you're not getting 50,000 claims a year, you're getting 1,000 or 2,000 claims a year. Big ticket, really significant R&D, and with claims down to that kind of number, you can have a swift and effective pre-clearance process, meaning that business gets confident the release is available, therefore it becomes an incentive.
But business people in the real world that I know who've used that system, if they're real innovators and are trying to do things at the margins and frontiers of understanding of science and innovation, the notion that somehow there's a pre-clearance process amongst a group of officials and well-meaning and well-appointed civil servants who can do that efficiently, I think is optimistic. Wouldn't you actually chill the creativity and innovation amongst quite significant parts of the new economy because you didn't have the capacity to efficiently process them? I mean, there is a trade-off to what you're saying. I mean, I totally get the logic of it. You make it more certain for a small number of people, and that has a clear impact. But you would also chill a long tail of innovation from which lots of innovative businesses grow.
I don't think you would, because today only the very brave start a project knowing R&D tax relief will apply. They apply for it afterwards. They often have an extremely painful process of getting HMRC to agree that relief applies.
But I mean, with the greatest respect, you're making an assertion with no proof of what the outcome would be. Could you point to other jurisdictions of comparable nature where this is, where we could look at as an example of where we can see better outcomes for doing it another way?
Well, there aren't, because I don't think any other country has R&D tax relief anything like as generous as ours. The alternative model, particularly in America recently, is a model of grants.
We'll get on to tax relief in a moment, but I would just comment that a lot of my local breweries, I have a lot of microbreweries in my constituency, use R&D tax relief, and that's quite a challenge, I think, for HMRC or anyone to understand a brewery versus a big high-tech business. So there's quite a range, as you say, Mr. Needle. Mr. Coughlin.
A question to Dan Needle, and full disclosure, I'm pushing this myself. The Times reported yesterday that the Treasury is looking at allowing full expensing of patent purchases in this space, and that there's London Business School research showing that has 10 to 20 times the payoff of what Jeremy Hunt did with Fiscal Plant Capital, and that gives an actual transaction in terms of the tax relief rather than an R&D tax credit, where it's quite vague in terms of the... Is that something you've looked at?
Absolutely. I mean, when Jeremy Hunt brought in full expensing, that wasn't really full expensing because it's limited to particular classes of plant machinery and so forth. There's compelling research that actual full expensing could boost GDP by 1%. That would mean a more minimal version of it just relates to IP. The maximalist version is you abandon the distinction in the tax code between income and capital, and everything becomes tax deductible, and that has a very significant GDP effect. On its own, it'll be quite expensive. So it would also mean that someone who borrowed to buy an asset was getting tax relief twice, once for the interest, once for the asset. So realistically, full expensing would have to be accompanied by a significant restriction or even an ending of tax relief for interest. Now, that's a tax reform which the IFS has written about. There's compelling evidence that it boosts GDP, but it wouldn't be the easiest thing politically.
Ms. Coleman? Yuan Yang.
Thank you, Chair. The previous Treasury Committee wrote a report about tax reliefs, of which there are over 100 non-structural tax reliefs costing roughly the equivalent of the NHS budget each year. So a question to anyone on the panel, how have we come about with so many tax reliefs, and is there any evidence out there that they do what they were intended to do?
Professor O'Brien.
How they've come about is exactly the sort of discussion we've been having, which is you identify there's a problem over here and say, you know what we really need? We need to encourage this kind of investment. There isn't anything for these kinds of people. We need to do this. There isn't enough of this kind of industry, this kind of person is having this kind of problem. Let's create something. Rather than thinking, well, what is it in the system that would be improved by doing this? I have just two specific reflections on this. One is in terms of what's the evidence base for this. I mean, members of this committee will have seen the NAO report from last year. that says that HMRC on this £200-ish billion worth of reliefs spend £600,000 a year evaluating that, so sort of £1 for every 300,000 going out the door. That's clearly an area where we could potentially spend a bit more money that would have quite a high return. I think the other thing actually that's really important, and I think gets missed a lot in the discussion about reliefs, is what do we mean by reliefs? There's that long list of reliefs in there, but clearly something like the non-dom regime, which Jeremy Hunt scrapped and Rachel Reeves has gone further with, was there in a sense as a structural relief. I mean, it was there as a non-structural relief. It was there as a relief. It was, why was it argued for? It was argued in the more recent years for as it's encouraging people to come here. It's a clear economic type argument. But it was never evaluated as to what is the cost benefit of that. And that was not on that kind of list. Something that's still not on that list is something like, is it sensible for partnerships to have a lower rate of national insurance contributions than companies? That's clearly, in a practical sense, we don't argue for that for any other reason. So why do we have that kind of thing there, and why are we not costing those? So that list of reliefs that's out there is actually very partial in terms of what it's covering. And I think part of the problem is it leads us to focus on those things which we need to focus on because they are a problem, but to miss sometimes actually very significant, very substantial, both in terms of revenue and in terms of the economic consequences, areas of the tax system that are just not listed there because they're kind of structured in a slightly different way.
And would anyone on the panel like to suggest how the government could start to evaluate and rationalise tax reliefs?
I'll say something if you like. I mean, I'll just echo Arun's point that I think often the word relief kind of gets the debate off in the wrong foot in some sense. I think you have to start thinking about what you really mean by relief. So just some of the big chunky things. Like Arun's mentioned that there are some things not on that list that you might think of as reliefs. There are also some things on that list that I would just call part of the tax system, like part of the design of the tax base. So take one that we might talk about later, the kind of upfront pensions tax relief. That's a big chunky sum of money. In my mind, that's not a relief at all. That's just you have to decide when to tax pensions at the front or at the end. We decided at the front, and therefore we call it a relief. But it's just the design of the tax system. So again, could you scrap that? Well, yes, but that would just be not scrapping a relief. It would just be change the design of the tax system. So I think we have to start with what I think you have to define a relief relative to what you want the tax system to do. So once you know what you want the tax system to do, what design it, then we can think about when have you deviated from that and for what reason. So things like R&D tax credits or the business asset disposal relief or many others, then I think you have to look at them kind of on their own merits and be really clear what is it you wanted that relief to do. And that's actually much harder than it sounds. I've looked at lots of these reliefs over time, and often there's no policy intent written down anywhere, or the policy intent has changed every 6 months because someone's got layered their most recent thing they thought they were doing with that. So you're trying to evaluate an ever-moving target in some sense. So look, I think some reliefs are very clearly part of the tax system, and I would defend sort of on a theoretical basis based on what you are trying to have the tax system do. I think upfront pensions tax relief is one of those types. Other ones, like an R&D tax credit, are much more in the spirit of you are trying to actively encourage something or you're trying to actively change behaviour. Then you need to evaluate them on a case-by-case basis, which speaks to Arun's point about where we have those things, we should put more effort into being really clear about what are they trying to achieve and evaluating them more clearly.
Mr. Needle?
Some of the reliefs also, the apparent cost of the relief bears no relation to the amount you'd raise by ending it. So take perhaps the largest relief, which is capital gains relief for principal residents. I think that's down there as 31 billion, huge figure. But no country in the world taxes capital gains on main residences full stop, because you couldn't have someone living in a £300,000 home that's gone up over the last 30 years and wants to buy another £300,000 home, but now they face a bill of £80,000. No system can work like that. So in practice, you always have some kind of deferral stroke rollover where the gain keeps rolling over and usually is never taxed. Or you have, like America, a very generous exemption that means only the very wealthiest pay it. So realistically, there is no prospect of ever getting that 31 billion.
Thank you, Ms. Young. We do
more tax reliefs, I'm afraid. I mean, I think the issue seems to be not necessarily individual reliefs in on themselves, because we can go away and evaluate all of them, and maybe some of them would end up on the scrap heap, but many of them probably end up finding justification themselves. But it seems to be the complexity of the system, the number that we have in play, and then who that ends up serving. So just one example is the patent box release, which has been spoken about a lot, and it seems that 95% have been claimed by the largest companies. Places like London, Oxford and Cambridge Life Sciences Hub have very low take-up of this particular relief. And I guess what that suggests to me is that the relief is correlating much more strongly of how big your financial department is rather than how much innovation that you're doing. And so would it be in HMRC's interest to simplify it and rationalise all the reliefs that are out there, or would that actually open it up to a much wider number of claims and end up costing the Exchequer more money? Or do we think that there's a scope for huge rationalisation? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'll leave patent box to Helen because she's definitely the expert on that one. She might explode having to deal with it though. But I think one thing you point out there is just in terms of the context of review. I mean, we mentioned earlier the comprehensive spending review that happened over the summer, but it's not comprehensive in the sense that tax expenditures are a type of expenditure that we don't evaluate, right? We don't have a formal process by which they all have to be looked at, and HMRC has to go cap in hand to the Treasury and say, I want these reliefs, can I afford it? And we're trading that off against some other thing that we want in schools or we want in health.
Reviews for everybody but
it's for everybody but HMRC and Treasury, right? And so it is a very odd position, just kind of constitutionally, that we're not looking at that in the round. Now, I'm not picking on any particular relief and saying this is the one that should go, and maybe they all are perfect, but at least there should be some process by which somebody has to justify that. And that would then, clearly put HMRC in a position where they wouldn't be able to essentially get away with spending only £600,000 evaluating those things. Any other department, when it wants to ask for money, has to have some evidence base for why this is worth spending. In a world in which there was some actual review of these reliefs, we might discover they're all great, or what the right tweaks are, and they should survive in some form, but there'd have to be spent some money on trying to prove that, to show that here's the impact, whatever level. Some will be costed better than others. It's always hard to get evidence on some of these things, but there's no process at all by which that's happening right now.
I would observe that Dame Harriet and I have both looked at this a lot over a decade in a previous role I had, and Dame Harriet in various guises, and there's a reluctance at HMRC to even publish them. So hats off to Dame Harriet and the previous committee for getting that list, because it took a lot to get it out, because they did not want to have to face the reality of having to evaluate them, because you don't get any political thanks for evaluating tax reliefs, I suspect.
No, exactly, but I think it's exactly that point, and genuinely credit to you for getting it to this point, and it is now. To Harriet for getting it to this point, but it is the case that now we've got here the next step that this committee hopefully will push them on, and the PAC and other committees will push them on, is actually, can we have some process by which these things are actually formally reviewed the way that all other spending is reviewed? Because without that, we're never going to get that's going back to John's earlier point. Where does the political pressure come from to try to fix some of these problems? Well, it comes from in other departments. The thing that tries to force efficiencies in other departments is you have to make trade-offs and you have to work out what you can spend, and there's nothing like that in HMRC.
To come in.
Yeah, no, I was going to say, I agree with that. I think there's lots of parts of the system where you can just see what's happened as things have been layered on and over time. And at every point in time, the budget is approached as a kind of what else can we layer on? We want a new incentive to add without ever thinking about the stock. So, an area that I've thought lots about is thinking about small businesses and the various incentives that are going on there. So, the reduced rates of capital gains tax through the business asset disposal relief, what was entrepreneurs relief, the lower rate of corporation tax on small companies, a whole network of VC schemes. I have to carry a little list around to remember which all they all are. Nobody ever sat down, I think, and thought about of all these different schemes, how are they supposed to be interacting? Why do we have these different schemes? What are they doing? And we still talk about other schemes. So I think, again, stepping back and thinking, what do you want to do? At which point in the life cycle of business do you want to incentivise something? Why do you have these various schemes? Before you even start with thinking about a new scheme. And that's just one. I think there's lots of examples of that where things have been layered on over time. Or the historical accidents. And so, VAT, to take a completely different example. We have loads of bits of these VAT zero rates that are a hangover from a system we had before VAT, but they've kind of carried over and we just can't get rid of. So I think it's partly about being really careful whenever anything new is introduced to first think about what could we reduce, simplify, remove before we just layer something else on.
And very briefly,
just very quickly, on EIS, SEIS, VCT, the continuity there has been welcomed by many people. So, there is a danger, of course, that we've got to stand up for things that have had an enduring certainty as a stimulant for investment in areas of innovation.
Well, I think you have to stand up. So I think stability is really important. I think predictability. So stability shouldn't mean that we can never change anything, because a lot of the tax system is rubbish. So I think we have to have a way to get from here to somewhere better. I think the way to do that is predictability rather than just stability per se. And look, something can be stable but rotten, right? So, look, and I'm not saying that's true of all the different schemes, but there are lots of them. Like, I think we should imagine a world in which we had a different set of schemes that were better targeted, that cost less money. And you're absolutely right, not just add another one or tweak something for sake, but have a system that thinks, actually, this would be better. Let's transition towards that in a way that's stay predictable and everyone knows it's coming. Maybe keeping some bits of that system, but not keeping it just because we happen to have had it for a long time.
Thank you.
Professor Advani.
Just very briefly, I think one way to think about this is the mapping with what happened with universal credit. Right? Whereas before universal credit, we had all kinds of benefits that were all layered on top of each other, and actually nobody stepped back and said, well, what's the interaction of these things and what's it doing to work incentives for particular groups of people? It's different for everybody because it depends on how many kids you have and where you're living and what the rent is. And the upside, for all of the criticisms that you can have of universal credit and the exact levels of things, the general perspective was to say, well, actually, we need to make sure that this system works as a system because we need individuals who are using it to be able to know what their incentives are and to not have crazy incentives at certain points where it doesn't make sense to work or it doesn't make sense to do certain kinds of things. There's basically the same problem for businesses where it's really hard to figure out what you're supposed to do and what you should be trying to do. And this sort of point about the finance department is really strong, which is unless you can find access to somebody who can tell you what's the right way to structure things, you can face all kinds of weird incentives depending where you are. And actually a step back to look at how does the whole system interact would be really valuable.
Okay, I'm just aware of time, so and we're now going to move on to some more specific options or things that are being discussed that the Chancellor might do. So if we could perhaps, we may not get to talk to all four panellists on every issue, so if you've got something you'd like to say in particular, please let us know. And I'm going to start with John Grady, MP.
Just actually looking at the macro position, escaping reliefs for a moment, how, Professor Advani, does our tax burden compare with countries with similar levels of public services, pensions and welfare systems?
So I guess there's two comparisons that people often make for the UK system. One is that in the recent years, the share of GDP that is government has gone up. The other is, relative to our kind of long-run historic standard, the other is to compare us across countries and say, actually, we're pretty average. We have a fairly similar share of government to GDP, effectively, and tax to GDP as many European countries at this point. We're slightly lower. We're certainly higher than the US. One thing that's really important to think about in terms of where do we want to be, and that's a political question, not one for us to be able to give you any answers on, is just to always remember that if we think about this as the state is providing some public services to the public, in a world in which a state chooses to provide more or less of those things, that's just a trade-off between what's being provided by the state and the public at large. So in the US, it's clearly a lower share of government to GDP, but that's partly because, for example, healthcare is private, and that's still part of the costs that the average person faces. So that doesn't make the ordinary person better off. Conversely, in European countries, there are more things that are taken away from the individual, so there's a higher tax burden, but there are more things that are provided by the public. And that's always worth bearing in mind what the size of the public sector is and what that means for individuals in the private sector.
So in simple terms, what you're saying is, number one, we've got a fairly average share of GDP in terms of tax and public spending. Number two, you can't have higher public spending and lower taxes. And number three, you could cut public spending, but you're still going to have to get your health insurance or whatever.
You're still going to have to pay somehow.
So we need to just start by facing into that fundamental fact.
Yeah.
Ms. Curtis, do you have anything to add to that?
I mean, I was going to say something very similar, so I'll be brief, but I don't think we should be surprised that the tax burden in the UK is at a historic high, or the state is at a historic high. We choose to provide healthcare through the state. We have an ageing population, and the governments have successfully chosen to expand the role of the state, most recently in childcare. So the tax burden, exactly as Professor Advani says, is not a separate feature from that. The more we do through the state, the higher the tax burden
so
will be.
So what you'd say, Ms. Curtis, is politicians would do well to stop kidding people on. We can have lower taxes and, a big state. That's just not happening.
Absolutely, the two need to match in the end.
And then on the point of kidding on, if you look at the OBR's report in March, it points to higher defence spending, climate change, ageing population, and effectively says that unless we change our tax system and get a grip on public finances and or get some growth, debt would rise to over 270% of GDP by the mid-70s. So we're not going to be able to escape this basic fact that if you want these public services, you've got to pay for them anytime soon, are we?
No, exactly. So those long-run forecasts are helpful because they tell you, are we about to overcorrect and then enter a period where things get easier, and they very clearly tell you that things get harder. Most of the action in those long-run forecasts are on the spending side, so they effectively assume that we continue to provide the same level of pensions and the same level of healthcare, and then you get an unsurprising pressure on public services. What we do about that is clearly a political choice, whether we choose to provide fewer public services or to raise taxes from this point further in the future to make those two things add up.
And then question for Ms Miller. I mean, the UK suffered a range of significant shocks: financial crisis, Brexit, COVID and Ukraine, and we can see debt to GDP rising alongside those shocks. And does it necessarily follow that, number one, the public finances are now in a state where we'd struggle to withstand a further shock in the same way, and therefore we do have to get debt under control, particularly given the current price of debt?
Yeah, so debt is higher than it's been for a long time, and I think you can already see the effects of that coming through, because the debt interest bill is high right now. This is not a problem that we're talking about our grandchildren having. This is a problem that's biting right now, and I think the reason to start getting that debt down in the good times, and these don't necessarily feel like good times in an absolute sense, but relative to what another shock coming along, is so that you have the capacity to bear another shock. That doesn't mean that if a shock hit tomorrow, we could do nothing about it. We could. But if you never have plans to get things looking better in the good times, then you are going to be more exposed to, at some point, you have more shocks and you can't deal with it. I'd also say on the sort of previous question, I think it relates. You can easily, I think it's really important to look at the long-run fiscal forecast, because it does give you a sense of what's going to come. You could easily look at lots of spending pressures and add them up to a point where actually the government would need to be the entire economy. If you add up ageing and net zero and defence, and obviously that can't happen, right? So I think what that speaks to is, yes, there are always going to be choices, exactly as Ruth set out, on the size of the state. What do you want the government to do? And so once you've decided that, then that kind of defines what you need the tax burden to be in some sense. But it's also the case that it can't be the answer that we always just spend our way out of. Mechanically, it can't be the answer that you always just spend more. The answer has to fundamentally be that we get more productive, both in terms of the public sector being as productive as it can be. So for every pound spent, you get the most good stuff out of that. But also, as an economy, it comes back to the growth point. So your point about, how do you get ready for the next shock? If the way to get ready for the next shock is that you sort of pay down the debt, that is a really hard way to get down the debt. What we've done historically has not been that. Why is it the case that after the Second World War we had a high debt and we weren't just paying it? It was growth. So I think, why I come back to this point, what's going to make all of this easier? It's not just making the state bigger, it's not just paying down the debt, although we might have to do that in the short run. It's really trying to get that growth up, because that's what will allow us in the future to have more healthcare, more medicines. Yep. It will be the growth point, and that relates to both of those things.
And I guess probably a yes-no answer to that then. Not only must politicians be straightforward with people about the tax choices, but actually the choices for growth and things like controversial planning permissions and things like that get you growth. You actually have to push them through, because otherwise we'll just stay in this funk, for want of a better word.
I think these are all part of the same choice. There's choice about what you can do to drive up productivity and growth, and then whatever you've done with that, the choice about how big the state should be and how to fund it are all related choices.
Thank you very much, Mr. Reilly. You and Anne.
Thank you very much, Chair. Turning to wealth taxes, a topic which has come up very frequently recently. Professor Advani, you were part of the Commission on Wealth Taxes a few years ago. Could you start off just by describing what wealth taxes are and why the Commission came to the conclusion that we should fix our current wealth taxes in the UK first?
Wealth tax, sort of writ large, is a tax that adds up all of the value of the things you own. So your home, if you share that with somebody and you have a mortgage, take the mortgage off first and divide it between the owners of the home. Add the value of your house, pensions, shares, savings, anything you have, make a big stack of that, work out the total value, draw a line somewhere and say, so this is all your wealth, draw a line somewhere and say the bit above that, that's the bit that's taxable, and that's what a wealth tax does. It sets some threshold and says, if you have net wealth, once you've added up all the things you own and taken off all the debts, the bit above that is what is taxable. When we looked at this in 2020 as part of the Wealth Tax Commission, I was one of the 3 commissioners there, our first conclusion was that the UK has other taxes on wealth. It has capital gains tax, it has inheritance tax, it has taxes on flows from wealth like dividends, and these things don't work particularly well. And we can talk later on about specifics around inheritance tax or capital gains or whatever you're interested in. And given that those things don't work well, it doesn't make sense in the UK to start with trying to invent new taxes when existing taxes are broken. We should definitely fix those ones, and you'd get a long way towards raising more money from wealth and raising that money in a better way, in a way that's less damaging for growth, if you were to fix those sorts of things.
What kind of fixing needs to be done?
So capital gains tax is a good example. Capital gains tax, I think we're all going to be in furious agreement over what the reforms are here, because we've all written about this in some form or other. Yeah. But we currently tax at a low rate relative to income gains when you make them, whether or not you were sort of overall successful. So what that means is somebody who invests, they might be unlucky, in which case they don't make very much growth. They might, they could have put money in the bank and got 5% in recent years, but instead they invested and they only made 4%. But now when they sell out of this asset, we're going to charge them capital gains tax on their full value of that, but at a lower rate than income tax. What you would really want to do is to say, look, we don't want to charge you tax on anything that you would otherwise be able to have just got that same rate saving. That's not going to encourage investment. We'll exclude all of that, so have an investment allowance that takes that entirely out of tax. And then if you're making more return than you would have just got from saving in a bank or something else, then in that case we'll tax that, and we'll tax that at the same rate as other income, because that either came because you worked really hard and tried to do better than you would have done in a bank, then it's the same as your labour, or you got really lucky. In that case, there's no reason to tax privilege that luck, or it came because you have some sort of market power, some sort of control. There's again no reason why you'd want to tax that at a lower rate than income. That removes the incentive to shift income, as people have now, into capital gains. What that means in practice is somebody who might be a consultant working for a company, leaving that company, setting up as a private business, because by keeping their money inside the company, getting paid in their own private company, instead of taking their income as a standard income where there's income tax and gains, they can store money inside that company, build it up, and someday liquidate that company. And liquidation of a company is treated as a capital gains tax event in the UK tax system, and so you would get a much lower tax. That sort of bad relief that Helen mentioned earlier, that was, is now taxed at 14, going on to 18%, which is obviously much lower than the top rate of tax they might otherwise have paid of 47% effectively.
Yeah. So is your proposal then the equalisation of those rates with income tax?
Yeah, I would say that you'd want to equalise income tax rates with capital gains tax rates with income tax rates, but introduce an investment allowance to take the effectively normal rate of return out, and close a couple of other gaps in the capital gains tax system. That would be around people being able to leave without paying capital gains tax. They should have a settling up charge to make sure that they don't just leave and not pay the tax, and also a carryover so that somebody who inherits an asset inherits the benefit of that asset, but also inherits the base cost. Currently not doing that means that people holding on to assets till they die have all the capital gains tax wiped out. And one cost of that is that encourages people to hold assets that are no longer the right things they would want to own, and that's bad for growth.
There's some nodding in the panel. Is the panel in furious agreement, or does anyone want to add anything?
Helen Miller?
Yeah.
I was just going to add, so we are in agreement because we've all written about this, but I think it's worth, kind of stepping back, it's worth just being really clear about what the problem is, because I think this is kind of confused policymakers for a long time. I think we're stuck in a rut for a reason. So the way to think about it, I think, is that there are two problems with currently how we tax returns to capital, whether that's capital gains or dividends or any other kind of interest. And one is the rate differential, and that's the one that's really salient and easy to see. We give lower rates to returns to capital, which means you incentivise people to get returns to capital however they can, and that's a problem. And that's the one that you see rates go up and down over time as people trade off, where you have higher rates, it's good for inequality, then you have lower rates, and that's good for investment. And it's absolutely true that if all you do is put up rates on investment incomes, you are discouraging investment. And there's a trade-off there. The thing that's not in the debate, because it's technically much harder to explain, but it's just as important, is all the tax-based stuff, which is what Arun was explaining. So I think the only way out of this horrible trade-off, where you're trading off kind of inequality and investment incentives, is to properly fix the tax base. And what you basically do is you fix the tax base so that you're not discouraging investment. I think the most salient example of this, but it's not the only one, is we currently tax inflationary gains through capital gains. We shouldn't be taxing inflationary gains. But that is one easy to understand problem. There are many of that type of problem. Get rid of that problem by designing the base properly. Yeah. With that base reform, then you can increase rates without reducing investment incentives. But for my mind, the debate is always completely swamped with discussions of rate differentials, and we don't talk enough about the really important tax-based stuff.
Mr. Needle, very briefly.
Yes, it's the effective rate that counts. So when Professor Advani says equalise the rates, what that actually is that is a significant cut in the effective rate for people making long-term investments. Or in fact, not even that long-term. In the last few years, you could have easily made a 20% return cash, which is a loss in real terms. And the UK currently taxes you on that. There's plenty of evidence that decisions to invest are driven by effects like that, by rates of capital gains tax. What Professor Advan's proposal also means is you're increasing the effective rate on entrepreneurs who aren't putting capital in, but are, economists would say entrepreneurs hate this description, but it's nevertheless true, that they are being rewarded for their labour income over time, not for putting capital at risk. And Professor Advan's proposal increases the tax rate on those people. Now, there is an absence of evidence that that would discourage entrepreneurship. Why? I think one reason is the prospect of a future capital gain is just too far away. Another reason is that you would have to be either psychic or crazy to look at today's capital gains rates and think that you will be paying them in 15 years' time when you exit. So, yeah, I strongly support the proposal, and it also has the merits of raising quite large amounts of revenue. We calculated that you could equalise rates with an investment allowance, you could raise $6 billion of revenue, and cut income tax by a penny.
Well, we'd be interested to see that. Ms. Young?
Yeah,
Mr. Glenn.
just on this sort of capital gains tax equalisation, because my colleagues raised it. So, just in terms of the behavioural effects, I mean, we've obviously seen quite a lot of change over the last 15 years. I think broadly George Osborne reduced the rates, and then now we're talking about equalising it again back to where it was in the 80s with all the caveats that you've gone through. But in terms of the behavioural effects in some sectors of the economy where actually there are other jurisdictions, particularly with some of the new sectors where the UK is good at, in the tech sector, where there is mixed evidence that's disputed by some on the committee around how many people are leaving the UK. And of course, how do we convey that we're open for growth and entrepreneurship if the sort of headlines are that the rates of tax are going up? And clearly, somebody who's an employee, with all the certainty that brings in terms of their income, versus putting sometimes significant and different stages of capital at risk for a very long-term proposition of maybe significant capital, but a lot of risk and uncertainty along the way. Are you not concerned that the optics of this change would have, again, I've used the word before, a chilling effect on people's enthusiasm to put capital at risk, which is material to the growth prospects of the economy?
I mean, obviously, politicians, if a change like this were ever going to happen, it would be for politicians to explain and sell essentially what it is that's changing. But the proposal very much is to say, look, if you're putting capital at risk, we're basically guaranteeing you a rate of return on that capital that will not be taxed. An investment allowance, a bit like Lawson's inflation allowance, but more generous, indexation allowance, but more generous, would say, if you put actual money at risk, you're not going to pay tax on that, you're not going to pay tax on a certain level of return on that, and only if you happen to do well enough to make a return above that will there be any tax at all. And in that case, if you're doing better than that, certainly the tax rate is higher than the current one, but actually there's a good chance, as people know who are in these kinds of industries, there's a good chance you invest and you lose, and you do it a couple of times and you lose, and then at some point you are successful. And all those losses would be now more valuable to you. You'd be able to hang on to them, you'd be able to use them against that future investment you'd make, because the point about investment is it's a very uncertain thing, as you highlighted.
Before the first budget of this new government, there was quite a lot of questions about this happening then. There didn't seem to be any sort of plan to put it in, but there was an uptick in some of the rates. And it was discerned that was sort of just about accommodatable around changes in behaviour. Do you not think that so soon after making another significant change, when apparently the Chancellor came before the committee in November and said she wouldn't be coming back for significant changes again, undermines the sort of credibility of the government in this domain?
I echo Dan's point, which is that the capital gains tax system sadly has moved around quite a lot over the last sort of.
It's moved around recently.
But I agree, it's moved around recently, and I'm on the record saying that I didn't think it was sensible last year to have made that change without fixing the tax base, which Helen's already described. I think if those kinds of changes are going to happen, it would be important to explain the rationale, what the rationale is for this, and why this would be a system that actually should be supported kind of all around.
Why wouldn't you've done it properly in one go at the start, rather than do it iteratively, bringing the uncertainty? You
will surely have the Chancellor before you ask her that. I think one point I would like to pick up though, is on the point about the costing and sort of, this sort of discussion. I mean, I don't think we've seen a proper estimate of what does HMRC think is the sort of revenue maximising point or something for capital gains tax. But one thing that's really important to understand is that any of these kinds of Laffer effects or optimal tax points, they really depend on the design of the system, right? And so what that tax rate is changes if you remove, for example, some of the leaks in the tax system that come from people being able to leave the country without paying capital gains tax. If you allow people to hold on taxes to die. So you have a settling up charge that says if you are leaving the country, just like almost every other G7 country has, if you're leaving the country, you pay the capital gains tax that has built up on the asset you've accrued here. We're not charging you more than that, but these are the gains that you accrued in the time you're here. You combine it with a rebasing on arrival, by the way, so that anyone who comes with any capital gains, we're not going to tax those. We're only taxing the gains you make while you're present in the UK, but for as long as you're tax resident in here, we look at the accrued gains over that period, and if you leave with gains of that sort, then you can pay that tax. That doesn't also mean that on departure you're paying the tax up front. It just means that that is a tax charge that applies at that point, and it can be paid at some point over time.
Dame Harriet.
To go back to wealth taxes, if I may, Chair, and clearly the context is this is a Labour Chancellor, a Labour government, lots of Labour backbench MPs calling for a wealth tax, and so I just wanted to set the context to ask up front if any of you are or have been members of the Labour Party.
I'm a member of the Labour Party.
Okay, all right, that's just,
It doesn't stop me being very critical of the last budget.
I would notice. Can I just ask philosophically, again, this is a yes-no question. Do you believe that if you tax something, you get less of it?
Always.
Always. You all believe.
All taxes have trade-offs. It's very strange to see people talking about tax and thinking that you can have a tax increase in it and it doesn't have an effect other than raising money. There's always an effect. Sometimes it's an effect you want. Sometimes it's an effect you don't want, but you live with it. I mean, income tax is an example. But
yes, no, then.
Yes, but a wealth tax is particularly serious because of the disincentive effect it has on investment. Maybe I should step back and say, let's say we all agreed that a wealth tax was a fantastic idea and Rachel Reeves should go out immediately and announce that she's going to do one. If she did that, almost certainly there wouldn't be a pound of revenue raised for 4 years. So a wealth tax is no answer to the current fiscal issues.
So do you all accept, with a yes-no, that if you taxed wealth in the way outlined at the beginning by Professor Advani, that you would get less wealth?
Yes.
Everyone's nodding. Okay.
Yeah, so that's,
Are there any examples of things that the Chancellor did in last year's budget where the outcome has been that we have got less of one of the things that she chose to tax?
I would think every single
one.
Every single. Okay. I mean, the obvious one is
examples where that didn't happen.
Oh, that didn't happen.
While we're thinking about it, I think the thing to think about, how can you design a tax that doesn't distort behaviours or change something? There are a couple of things you can do. It has to be something like, for example, a windfall one-off tax that everyone believes is credibly one-off. That's or like, you tax land in a way and like you can't change land in the country. There are a couple of types of taxes where the nature of the tax is such that there is nothing an individual can do to escape that tax, and there's no change in future behaviour that they have an incentive to do. If you can do something like that, that is the type of tax that gets you away from this. They are rare and hard to do. Most taxes, most of the time, change incentives and people respond to those incentives. And it's just that taxes do that to different degrees depending on all sorts of things.
Now, I was going to ask about that because does anyone seriously think that if the Chancellor came in and said, this is a one-off, I'm just going to top slice a chunk of what you've accumulated over your life, that anyone would believe that?
No.
No.
I mean, so when has that worked? The Labour Party's windfall tax in 1998 was said to be run off from retrospective. And I advised hundreds, probably thousands of companies. None of them thought that tax would be repeated. That really was a coherently argued retrospective tax, agree with it or not. But a wealth tax, if you really were able to raise a very large amount of money with a one-off tax, you create the infrastructure to do it, the temptation to press that button again is just going to be irresistible.
Rick Curtis.
And do you think that people who have wealth are more mobile internationally than people who don't?
Well, they are, but even
we
more
were
than
advising
that.
Mr Needle, presumably.
A
A while ago.
Even more than that, because the most difficult people of all, when you think about wealth taxes, are foreigners investing in the UK, because you have a terrible choice. One answer is, let's not tax rich foreigners investing in the UK, let's exempt them from the wealth tax. But if you do that, you make British-owned businesses uncompetitive significantly versus foreign-owned businesses. It's a problem Norway is currently having. They talk about Norwegian businesses being bought by foreigners. The other way you do it, more economically consistent, is to say, OK, we will tax rich foreigners investing in the UK, we'll apply the wealth tax to them. But if you do that, which wealthy foreigner or wealthy privately owned business will invest in the UK when they could invest in France or Germany instead and not have that? So it's an impossible conundrum.
Ms. Curtis.
Yeah, I'll just add a couple of things. I mean, on a one-off wealth tax, I think the other issue is what problem are you trying to solve? And the problem we have in the fiscal position of the UK is that we're running a structural deficit, and the challenge the Chancellor's trying to meet is to reduce that. And a one-off wealth tax would get the debt down a bit, but it doesn't address that fundamental problem. So I would criticise it on those grounds as well. I think then the wealth tax debate has sort of two legs to it. One is we need to raise some money. Now, if you want to raise substantial amounts of money, we have to think about who owns the great proportion of wealth and what is it made up of. It's largely in property and in pensions, so we have to talk about how we tax property and pensions, and we're not talking about a bunch of uber wealthy people who hold their wealth in very different ways. We have to think about property as the biggest asset in the country and how we tax it. And then there's a second argument around wealth taxes, which is around inequality and a sense that this kind of uber wealth is a problem that we want to address through the tax system. And I guess that is a valid political debate, but it's not an area where you would see kind of a significant revenue raised.
Do you all accept that since last year's budget there have been reports from New World Wealth, I think, First Alliance, the Adam Smith Institute for Economic Affairs, just a range of different organisations, Oxford Economics, Centre for Economic and Business Research, all saying that people with wealth have left the UK. Do you accept that that is possibly factually correct?
Can I say two slightly contradictory things? The first thing is I'm certain that a significant number of very wealthy non-doms have left the UK. I talk to a lot of people in private banks, private wealth advisors. They generally estimate between 5 and 10% of their richest non-dom clients have left the UK. So there's absolutely an effect.
And that's a direct effect, you're saying, of what's
a
happening.
direct effect of the Conservative
So
and then the
different to
Labour
previous years.
non-dom changes, yes. It doesn't necessarily make them wrong or right, but that's a fact, I'm certain of it. Second thing is, a lot of the figures we see are bogus. We analysed the New World Wealth figures because private bankers were telling us they thought the New World Wealth figures for emigration were too small. We employed forensic accountants to look at their figures, and we discovered statistical artefacts which are inexplicable other than by fraud or manual manipulation of the numbers. And we published a report on that, which the FT covered. So the New World Wealth figures, I would caution anyone against referring to them. They are at best very flawed, and at worst they're fraudulent.
Do you believe that people haven't left the country then, as a panel? Or do you think people have left the country, but just not as many as in some of the reported examples?
The Treasury, the OBR, anticipated 25% of the richest non-doms would leave the UK. Pausing to say, leave the UK if you're very wealthy. If you're worth billions or hundreds of millions of pounds, you probably spend 3 months, 4 months in the UK. Leaving the UK means you spend a couple of weeks left here. It's not very dramatic. But the OBR expected 25%. My contacts think they're seeing 5 to 10%. Who knows what the true figure is?
No one knows the truth on this, but do you think it is higher or lower than what the Office for Budget Responsibility estimated would be the impact? Higher or lower? Just a one-word answer.
I don't know.
You don't know.
Okay.
Are there any aspects of the changes that the Chancellor brought in last year that, if reviewed and changed, would stop something which is as yet unquantified but seems to be a reduction in the potential future tax revenues accruing to the UK economy?
A couple of things. I mean, they're always harder once you start them, but one area is that what we currently have in terms of the inheritance tax, which again was actually announced by Jeremy Hunt and has been maintained by Rachel Reeves. The inheritance tax position is that when you come to the UK, a kind of clock starts, and if you get to over 10 years in the UK, tax resident in the UK, you're covered by inheritance tax. That means if you're in the UK for 9 years, 364 days, and you get hit by a bus, no inheritance tax. 1 day over that, and suddenly you're paying 40% on your worldwide assets. That seems like quite a dramatic change. Now, clearly, somebody who arrives in the UK and hit by a bus on day one, we don't want them to be covered by inheritance tax. There's no logic to that. On the other hand, they've been here 65 years, living here from the age of 20. We probably all agree they should be paying inheritance tax here. And the question is, how do you move
on their
from
worldwide assets?
as everybody else does? So worldwide assets is the standard basis for tax for everybody who's UK born and who lives in the UK and not using this regime. So the question is, how do you get from here to there? And I think we have said before and maintain the position that having something that sort of tapers the rate up so that 10 years you maybe pay a 4% tax, after 12 years you pay a 12%, slowly moving the rate up would be a way in which you would smooth that transition, because the question you'd make when you sit down with your partner after 9 years and say, do we want to stay here another year, is not if we stay here one more year we go up by 40%, it's do we go up by 4%, and that maybe is more manageable. And the second thing that is worth looking at, I think, again in terms of encouraging people to stay here, currently the regime that we have, again it's been here for a long time, it wasn't changed by either of the previous two chancellors, is one in which we encourage wealthy people to come here but not to invest here. If you want to invest in the UK, you should not live in the UK. Because if you're living somewhere else, if you're in Dubai and you invest in the UK, 0% capital tax. If you live in the UK and you're using the new regime, the FIG regime, or using the old regime, you have 0% tax on investment anywhere in the world except the UK. If you invest in the UK, you pay the full rate of tax. So paradoxically, we're saying to people, come here, but do not bring your wealth. Do not invest any of it here. And actually, if you think the UK is a great place to invest, you should go and live somewhere else, and then you can invest here, because that's the way in which you can get a lower tax rate. So that would be clearly a thing that would improve both growth and would improve incentives for people to come and stay.
Does everyone else agree on that?
Yeah, I might go further, because another strange feature of the way they introduced the new rules is they kept the awful complexity and distortion of the old rules for your previous money. So you move into the new regime, all the money you kept offshore, which if you brought into the UK you'd be taxed on, you're still taxed if you bring it into the UK. I would have had either a one-off amnesty on that money or a one-off kind of a mandatory repatriation tax like the Americans did with corporates, so that we're then encouraging people to bring the money back to the UK.
I mean, it's worth saying we do have a repatriation tax. It's just that it's not mandatory. So you could choose to keep your stuff offshore. And I mean, the Chartered Institute of Taxation has recommended that actually there should be what they call a long stop, where if after a certain period of time you haven't brought that on shore, there's some point at which we just deem it to be brought on shore and it's all taxed. And so that would be something that could be looked at and would obviously raise money off on the bit that people don't choose to bring on shore.
But it is all about inheritance tax. When I sit down with very wealthy people and their advisors and they talk about what about the non-dom changes is prompting them to leave, it's always inheritance tax. People can live with a bit of income tax here, a bit of capital gains tax there. The rates aren't that different, but to go from 0 to 40% inheritance tax is massive.
Yeah. Finally, if I may, Chair, stamp duty, should it be reformed?
No, it's abolished.
Abolished.
Alongside other reform to property taxation.
Well, abolished from Professor Advani. Curtis?
So abolished, but as part of a wider property tax reform. Otherwise, the winners are homeowners of large properties, who are some of the people who've done best over the last 20 years.
Well, the future purchasers of them, yeah.
Dan Needle.
Yeah, abolish, but you need reform, because otherwise the winners are the current owners, because their property value goes up.
Helen Miller.
Yeah, you have to reform. I think you don't think of it in isolation. Think of the property tax. You need to reform council tax, make it proportional, upstate values, and levy that instead of current council tax and stamp duty.
Quickly, I mean, we talked about wealth tax as a slow burner. What time frame would you think that this could possibly be done in?
In
it's not in one parliament, I'm suggesting. I mean, it's really
I think you could. I mean, with the council tax, the thing that would take some time is the revaluation. So that would take some resources, clearly. So obviously you can't have that up and running by January. But I don't think we need to think, we're not so backwards as a country that we couldn't revalue our property within a reasonable time frame. I think you could say in a couple of years. I mean, that seems like a long time to me. Other countries do this, right? Technology is better now. There are apps out there who will value your property. It's not like we actually have to.
You think so you don't think valuation's a big challenge?
Well, no, I think it's a challenge.
No, I mean, not an impenetrable.
No, we put a person on the moon. Of course we can revalue property. Seriously, it's a challenge. Yes, it's a challenge. Yes, you have to put some resources. You'd need the valuation office to go and revalue property. But we absolutely could revalue our property stock. And then once you've got that, the technical how do you design a tax that's proportional to values, I mean, I can write it on the piece of paper now for you. That's not difficult, right? So no, of course, I'm not saying we could have it by January. I think it's absolutely reasonable that a government could say, we're going to, not rely on values that are 35 years out of date. We're going to have a value system. We're going to do it at this date. And as part of that package, you could also get rid of it. Of course, you would need to think about the timing in terms of announcing that, because the minute you say stamp duty goes in 2 years, I'm not selling my house in the next 2 years. I'm buying a new house. So you obviously have to think about the how you explain telling people that, but I don't think that's beyond the beyond.
And I think there are some of the more difficult issues probably are in how you transition from one system to another, and whether you could marry the politics of how quickly you charge people the new council tax, particularly people who've already paid stamp duty, versus not, and what those compromises can mean that in the short term it costs the government some money, and that would be a difficult thing at the moment.
Yeah, there's a lot of complexities.
One final additional complexity to add, just for the record, is that there is also the issue that council tax is local, and so there is going to be a lot of redistribution you'd have to do across local areas if you were to do something like this. And obviously, a lot of stamp duty is a loss of revenue to the Exchequer that isn't going to be made up for unless you have something that layers on top of council tax to make sure some of it comes back. So
people don't know about stamp duty until they have to pay it, so it's a sort of a hidden tax for a lot of people until it actually happens. John Grady.
Just quickly coming back to the wealth tax and the discussion on that, and it's a yes/no answer, please. The point is, wealth is mobile, money's mobile. We're in a world, after all, and we're just a small island off the north coast of Europe, albeit with a reasonable sized economy. So if we want to tax wealth and introduce other tax measures, we need the cooperation of our international partners past a certain point, don't we? Because the wealth moves otherwise. And so tax cooperation amongst states is important, difficult, and hard though it is to achieve. Is that something we need to be pursuing?
I'll give you a longer than one word answer, which is there are people, Zuckman in particular, who thinks there should be an internationally coordinated wealth tax to tax billionaires. What are the three countries with the largest numbers of billionaires? They are the US, China and India, who are against wealth taxes. It's a hopeless endeavour. We shouldn't even start.
Okay.
I'd just add there's a lot we could do to improve the UK taxation of wealth without doing that, so we shouldn't let it stop us.
I mean, the other thing that I would just add on that is, I'm sorry, it's not one word again, but the point about compliance is really important, which is HMRC, again, need more of this information anyway. I mean, separate from whether you want a wealth tax, just the state of information that we have and the way it's being used. Yes. It's something that needs to be improved for making sure the current rules are being operationalised effectively and that we're actually making sure we're collecting the correct tax from people under the current rules. If we don't have information like that, we know how important third-party information is. A big thing that reduced income tax evasion was the fact that most people are through PAYE. PAYE information is reported by my employer as well as by me, and so it's much harder for me to lie. We just need the same thing.
As we learned, and as we saw in COVID, where there's data, lots of things are easy to do. Bobby Dean, MP. Sorry, Yuan Yang.
Yeah, just following on that final point by Professor Advani, our sister committee, the Public Accounts Committee, reported in the summer that the HMRC doesn't know how many billionaires pay tax currently in the UK. Why is HMRC in this position, and how quickly can it be fixed?
HMRC's interpretation of the fact that the Tax Management Act is now more than 50 years old, it's the 1970 Act, and it says that HMRC should collect the information it needs to operationalise the current tax system. Now, clearly it needs to know about the things that are directly the tax bases, so it needs to know how much income I have so it can apply income tax to that. But it would be reasonable to operationalise the tax system for it to need to know more than just the very basics of those things, because for example, if it wants to know whether I'm paying capital gains tax correctly, it needs having some sense for how much assets, how much wealth do I have, is a way in which it can make sure that I am correctly paying that. It would be useful for it to know information about do I own additional properties, which it could get from the land registry, but doesn't currently use, so that it would know if I'm a landlord and it would know if I'm paying tax on rental income that I'm receiving correctly. So that kind of information is something that actually is justifiable for HMRC to use under the current system. It's not how they tend to interpret the current system. Partly it's a resourcing constraint. They don't have the capacity to bring all those things in and use them. Partly it might be reasonable after 55 years to update the Tax Management Act to account for the fact that the information that we have in general, how much more digital things are, has changed, and to be really explicit that this is stuff that HMRC should be using. Similarly, companies' house data, we know there are problems with that, and bringing that in, linking those things up would be another way in which you could improve some of the compliance issues.
Does the panel feel that HMRC is under-equipped at present to administrate a modern tax system?
I mean, going back to the point that they have £1 for every £300,000 of reliefs is how much they spend on it. I think there are lots of areas where you could say the resourcing doesn't look kind of up to scratch for what they need to do.
Which we've covered already, thank you. Bobby Dean, MP.
Thank you. Going to move away from the controversial taxes now and talk about inheritance tax. So on the one hand, you've got people saying this is outrageous, I pay tax all my life and then I die and they tax me again. And then other people say, this is outrageous, somebody's getting something for nothing and they don't want to put anything towards the NHS. And so you've got this dichotomy of abolish it or charge it 100%. I think the government will probably land somewhere in between those views in the next budget. And there's been talks around changing the amount that would be exempt, so whether there should be a lifetime cap or whether or not the 7 years should be extended possibly to 10. Does anybody have a view on those rumours that are out there and what behavioural effects they may have? Perhaps I'll start with you, Dan Needle.
Inheritance tax is a very strange tax in the UK because distributionally it's so curious that most people are never going to pay it. For the very wealthy, it remains the case that it's a tax on people who don't trust their children, because if you're very wealthy, you can afford to give almost everything except what you need to live in to your children. Live 7 years, you're done. But there's a cohort, maybe we call them the mass affluent, for whom they can't do that. They cannot give away their house because they're living in it. And so if you look at, there's a famous curve published by HMRC for the effective rate of inheritance tax for different sized estates, and it starts off at nothing, it goes up to kind of where you'd expect, and then it starts dropping off. So estates of 10 million pay about half the rate you'd expect. But that graph is a lie, because that graph is showing the value of a estate at death. They're very wealthy, have given away stuff well before death and don't appear in that chart. So their true effective rate is going to be even lower. So inheritance tax seems to fail in two very big ways, in that it taxes the very wealthy not much and taxes the mass affluent a lot more than
So
almost
would
every other
extending it
country.
from 7 years to 10 years or 15 years solve that problem because people wouldn't want to give up their wealth that early?
I'm not sure. I suspect they still would. If you are extremely wealthy, giving stuff away in your early 70s, say, feels like a practical thing to do. But it can't be stressed enough that for the mass affluent, the UK rate is in practice probably the highest in the world, maybe lower than Japan and Korea.
And I see Professor Aaron Advani wants to come in. What about the other aspect that's been floated as well, about potentially there being a limit on the amount of you could give away before your death?
Yes, I was going to just add to that, and exactly on that point, which is this maybe two different groups you should think about when you're thinking about who's being affected by inheritance tax. There's the fairly well off, in the single-digit millions of pounds. That's a lot of money for the average person, clearly. But there's that kind of person. There's people with tens of millions or whatever. If you're really wealthy, then this sort of strategy of giving assets away earlier in your life is a very effective one, and trying to increase that period, either increase the period that's covered by inheritance tax. So we used to have capital transfer tax that was a whole of life tax rather than just a 7-year rule. So you could go back to something like that was covering much further back in life, or putting in some sort of cap on gifts would be the way in which you would do that if that was something you were looking to do. Then there's this other problem, which is if you're thinking about inheritance tax as a tax that's there to sort of support social mobility in some sense, to account for the fact that one person got lucky and had parents who could support them when they were trying to buy a house and one person didn't. And that's really where you see those big differences build up in terms of your ability to accumulate wealth over your lifetime. Then things that are going 7 years, 10 years, that's not going to get you anywhere near that. It is only a much longer transfer, because the thing that really matters for your ability as a youngish person to build up wealth is, can you get on the housing ladder? And you see this huge bifurcation at that point between whether your parents can give you assets. And they're giving you those things when you're in your late 20s or 30s, and they're in their 50s and 60s. And that's almost surely, unfortunately not for everybody, but almost surely for most people, more than 7 years, more than 10 years before they're going to die. And so, and they're not thinking about inheritance tax at all. Those are not transfers that are done to try to avoid inheritance tax. They're done because I love my kids and they want to get on the housing ladder and I can afford it. Or I love my kids and they want to get on the housing ladder and I can't. And that's what creates that really big difference in what wealth looks like. By the time people get to their 50s, there's a huge difference in what their wealth is, depending on their parents, not because of any of the other things they're going to get at the point where they inherit, but just because of that early support. And so that's not something you're going to fix if you just go 7-10 years back. That's only going to be fixed if you want to fix it by either kind of whole of life tax effectively or a kind of cap on gifts. And those are political choices.
Mr. Dean.
And just moving on to the changes made last year to APR and BPR. Obviously, there was a lot of talk around APR, a little less around BPR, but I guess there might be similar grievances in both, which is that there was this intention to close a loophole that might have been exploited by particular people, but then there's been some genuine family farms and genuine family businesses that are now in a very sticky situation. Do you think that the government should revisit it at this budget, and what should they do? Helen, you smiled. Do you want to come in?
Ms. Miller?
Well, I think I probably got the strictest view, so why don't I start first? So look, I think people obviously disagree strongly with whether inheritance tax is a good tax or not. I think you can take different positions on that, and I don't take a position. If you have an inheritance tax, and we clearly do, I think there's a very, very strong case to apply it equally to all assets. Now, the thing that's been kind of latched onto is the avoidance possibilities, and everyone, it's well documented that once you have relief for things like farmland, you get people putting money into farmland in order to avoid inheritance tax. But that's, in my mind, not the only reason you should shut those things down. There's also just a much more basic fairness reason that if I pass on a house or a farm or any other asset, why am I treated differently by inheritance tax depending on how I chose to hold my assets? So on that basis alone, I think there's a reason to get rid of these reliefs. I also think if you want to support farmland or farmers or something about that group, I think we should be really specific and clear-headed about what it is you want to support. You might want to support biodiversity or agricultural independence or something else. Whatever you want to support, I find it very hard to think that the way to do that is by saying if you want to pass your farm to a family member, then we support you. But if you're a new farmer or you're a farmer that doesn't want to pass your farm on, then you get no support. So for all those reasons and others, I think it was actually right to move towards reducing the reliefs. I think you could argue you could actually go much further and just take them out of the system together. And my view is that, think about the economics, I would avoid trying to fiddle around and carve something else out.
Okay. Who next?
I agree with Helen in theory, but not in practice, because many small farms are fundamentally barely economic or not economic, and the effect of the inheritance tax change will be the breakup of a material number of small farms. Now, there is a point of view, a free market point of view, that says if they're not economic, then they should be broken up, and that's a correct result. It's a coherent view, it's not one I share. There's certainly a view that says, well, the answer shouldn't be inheritance tax, and this is Helen's view, we should have a better system of farm subsidy, and I'd agree with that, but that's not on the table. All we have is inheritance tax. And so I think we need to look very carefully at the budget changes. My fear is they went too far and not far enough. They went too far in overtaxing small farms. They didn't go far enough because they still give 50% relief to pure tax planning, inheritance tax investment. And the solution for that is in Professor Advani's hands, I think.
So I guess just to put forward some of the arguments that people make, I guess people would say that there is some inherent value to that being a family-run business or a family-run farm that we should protect, and otherwise the danger is that all of these assets go into venture capital funds and get stripped of their assets, don't think about their staff or whatever. Those are some of the arguments that people put forward. Is that far too sentimental for economists, or is there another way through?
I'm not an economist.
Yeah.
Well, I think you have to be a little bit careful. So, I mean, look, ultimately that's kind of an empirical question. We could go and look at, are family farms more productive? I think this is one way to think about the question, though. So if you have a family farm who you think will be broken up, and it's not like, I don't take a view on whether they're good or bad, but if you have one that you think it's valuable enough to be charged inheritance tax, but it hasn't got the profits to pay that tax, what is happening there? Why is it you've got this asset, it's really valuable, but it's not creating a return? Now, it could be that the price of farmland has been pushed up by avoidance, and actually shutting down the avoidance
Lincolnshire land
will bring down the price and will solve the problem for the family farms, because you won't have this disconnect between the asset value and the price. But it could also be the case that actually the fact that it's people really want that asset, but the current owner isn't getting a high value from it, that could also be telling you that there's a more productive use of that land. So yes, you can tell stories about some family farms being most productive in their family hands, but in that case, why aren't they creating a high return? You can also tell a story about actually it would be more productive for land to be reallocated. So all I'm saying, I'm not taking a view on that, I'm saying that we shouldn't tell ourselves a story. I think you can tell a story both ways.
Yeah. There will obviously be different objectives. So we could sell off all of our land to housing if we wanted to, and that would fix one problem, but it would give us food insecurity issues. So, Professor Aaron Advani?
Yeah, I was just going to take a sort of very pragmatic view of, given where we are, is there a scope, to your questions, is there scope for looking at this again? The relief that's being given, that's sort of being left, is £1 million for anybody who has any agricultural business property relief assets. But that doesn't depend on whether those assets are going to be otherwise at risk, right? And so the point, in theory, if you look at on the Treasury website, what does it say agricultural and business property relief are for? They are written there as being to prevent the breakup of these kinds of businesses. And yet, in many cases, the relief is going to people who have no risk of breakup, because actually most of the people who are claiming this relief and most of the value of this relief is going to estates where this makes 20%, 30%, 40% of their estate. There are no risk of breakup, because the tax could at most be 40% of their estate. It's less than 60% that's being spent, that is covered by these assets. These are not assets that in any world they would ever have to sell if they didn't want to, because they could always pay the tax out of other assets. At the other end, there are estates where actually the farm is 90% of their estate, and they have no other money they're going to be able to use. The only way in which they're going to be able to pay it, again, we can argue about what might happen to land prices and things if you were to make a reform, but in the current world, until any land price changes happen, they would be taxed at a rate which they couldn't afford to pay out of the remaining value of the estate. They could take something out of their income, but there are some from the work that we did, probably about 70 a year under the current reform, where they wouldn't be able to pay the tax out of existing assets and are therefore in some sense at risk of breakup. One adjustment that we proposed in work that we did at Centax was that you could instead have a minimum share rule that says, look, if less than 60% of your estate is agriculture and business property, including the farmhouse, then you're at no risk of breakup because you can always use the other parts of your estate to pay for this. So you do not need this relief. So we're taking the relief away from you, and what that allows us to do is to spend that money on increasing that £1 million cap for the people who are at some risk of breakup, because they are actually a very large share of their estate is covered by this. And you could then afford to raise that cap from £1 million to £5 million, which is at the individual level. So and there have been arguments about these things, but if there's a couple, that's £10 million. You're no longer after that talking about small family farms, and at that point there's the sort of arguments around could you afford to borrow or something else are much less salient than they are for the small family farms, where I think the cost of borrowing and the difficulty in being able to get the money to pay the tax could be a genuine concern.
Thank you. Steve? Okay, Dame Harriet.
Just one question on that. In terms of public policy, it's clearly important that the UK has the ability to grow food, and that's really at the heart of this, isn't it? Because if actually you all are very economically rational people suddenly say, well, there are more productive uses of that land, we would lose it to the ability to produce food. And is there a way that we can solve this issue that preserves that nature of the importance of the family farm, which is not only the land to produce the food, but also the ability and knowledge down the generations to pass on that ability to do something that we would all find challenging, which is to run a farm, and at the same time exclude people who've been buying the land purely because of its inheritance tax advantages. Isn't there a way we could do that in the tax system?
I think Professor Advani has done exactly that. Okay. But I and the team I work with came out with a proposal involving a clawback, which we thought was an answer to this, but I think Professor Advani's answer is better. It really does mean that small farmers wouldn't be paying inheritance tax, and that investors who are investing in farmland just for tax reasons would be. So for me, it's the solution. I think it also raises an additional 500 million. So it raises more tax too. Seems a slam dunk.
You would all recommend the Chancellor change the rules to reflect that? You all happy with those recommendations?
I think you
have to start with a clear. I don't think there's a kind of. I think you have to start with a view of exactly what you want to do. So I think if you were starting with the policy aim being you want to support food production, which I think is a perfectly reasonable security production, or biodiversity, or soil quality, or I think you could think there are a whole range of policies you can do to do that, including around planning and what you allow to go into different parts of the economy, around subsidies for farmers. So I think there's a whole plethora of policy levers the government has. I don't think we should load all of those policy aims onto just this one bit of inheritance tax. Now, if you decide, and I think it really is a policy aim as opposed to a kind of a absolute law of nature, that there's particular family farms and you don't want them to be broken up, then Arun's got a proposal that would protect those farms relative to other inheritance tax. But I think that's a policy choice, and it comes down to what the government wants to do.
And with other inheritance taxes, people have known about this 7-year rule, but because farmers were exempt from it, you've had farmers who are now well into their 70s and 80s who haven't done this. And that, again, seems to me really fundamentally unfair.
And I think that'd be relatively easy to change, in the sense that you could just give to current older farmers, or farmers that are close to the end of their life, the same tax avoidance opportunities they would have had they not died within the next 7 years. So you could say something like, if you sell your farm, or if you die, basically, well, we won't charge you inheritance tax if
you're about
to die. If you're about to die, but if you give away your farm within the next some period, and you could set that period 1, 2, 3 years, then you'll be exempt from inheritance tax. even if you go on to die within the next 4 years. So you could do some kind of transition there if that's the issue.
I think it is worth going back to where we started this conversation, which is we need to boost UK economic productivity and we need to simplify the tax code. And I think if we started with those two things in mind and we said we want to add another objective, which is UK food security, I would just be very, very surprised if the answer we came to was the right thing to do is to have a particular exemption to inheritance tax. So I think this really illustrates the problem with tax reform. If we hadn't started with this relief and we said we actually want to take further action to boost UK food security, I'd be very surprised, as Helen says, if an inheritance tax relief is what we decided was the most effective thing to do that. And so there will be losers from tax reform, and sometimes we do have to bear that cost.
Isn't the real problem here is the dysfunctionality of the combination of interventions are not, they're not aligned. So the incentives for environmental stewardship, food production, and then inheritance tax are all answered on different timeframes. But what I'm concerned about is that, to Helen Miller, the issue of actually having a universal standard treatment of, inheritance tax reliefs or not, I get from an economist's point of view. But the behavioural effects and the actual reality of the complexity of stewarding a farm with its very low margins, whilst there is meaningful uncertainty over many of the incentive schemes, means that doing it in this way was bound to have a negative consequence, wasn't it?
I think it was absolutely bound to have a consequence in the sense we talked about earlier, taxes have consequences. I mean, there are some people now who are subject to inheritance tax who are having to sell their family homes in order to pay inheritance tax. I mean, it is a tax that has consequences. Of course it does. And I mean, of course it was going to raise some revenue. Why it was going to raise some revenue?
We know farmers don't have high returns similar to other asset classes. So doing it when they had no expectation that it was going to happen, my colleague has dealt with the planning effect and how that might be mitigated, is very different to others. I mean, of course, people will have to do whatever they have to do, but there is a distinct case here where you've given no warning to it, and you've also got other support regimes which are material to the economic model of that class of assets that are being...
We can have a quick answer because this is talking about things that have happened rather than...
There's always a case to think, the big picture thing, there's always a case to think really clear-headedly, and this is what governments often don't do, about the full set of measures that apply to any given taxpayer and to transitions. And I think it's kind of to Ruth said, if you want to improve our tax system, that's going to mean taking some things away. And then you always have to think both about where you want to get to and how you transition. So of course, even if you want to get to an end goal like the one I set out, thinking about how you transition, how you deal with people who are already near the end of their life, how you think about provisions for how they pay it, of course that's all important.
Understanding how 70% of our economy works is probably, of our land mass works, is probably quite an important part of that.
It's always important to look at the whole.
And of course it's always worth saying that any change, even if it's to change something for the better, is also complicating for people because they've started making plans. So, and even no change can be challenging at times. So, Yuan Yang MP.
We're going to move from the countryside to our towns and cities and talk about rental profits. Ms Curtis, the Resolution Foundation has suggested shifting broadly from national insurance to income tax to create more of a level playing field between different types of income. What would be the impact on growth and inequality of this kind of shift?
Exactly as you say, at the moment, employment is taxed more than other forms of income. It's taxed more than self-employment, and it's taxed more than rental income or pensions, amongst others. So the reason we've suggested a raise in the income tax rate and a cut in the national insurance rate is to reduce the extra taxation on work. I think it is worth stepping back and thinking, if there was no manifesto and we were just faced with this economic challenge and we were looking at the big tax rates, which is the one that would be least economically damaging to put up? And I would say that is income tax, because of the challenges we have for inflation. That makes VAT difficult. If we then were to ask a different question, which is which tax would we all most like to cut economically, given that one of the ambitions of this government is to increase employment rates, I think that improving incentives to work, and we would get some labour supply benefit from cutting employee national insurance, would be a good place to look. So that's one reason you come up with this combination. You are right that we need to be honest that what that would mean is for people in employment and who get their income from employment, there would be no increase in the net rate of tax that they pay. The people who would pay higher rates of tax are landlords who have rental income, pensioners and self-employed. I'm happy to talk more about each of those.
And do you think such a shift should be implemented via a tax switch? And if so, and I appreciate this is a slightly philosophical question, do you think such a switch would break Labour's manifesto promises?
So I'm not a politician, and I don't think my expertise lies in the fine details of manifestos or how that would be judged. There are, as you say, different ways you could get to this. You could say what we want instead is national insurance on rental income or on pension income. When I think about how you would do this in a way that is simple for the tax system and transparent and clear for people what you've done, for me the tax switch is a better route through.
Briefly, Helen Miller wanted to come in briefly.
I was just going to come back and just point out this relates very much to exactly the conversation we had earlier about increasing taxes on capital income. So however you do it, whether it's a switch, whether it's an increase in national insurance, we just talk, for landlords and self-employed people, you're putting up their tax rates. And therefore you face exactly the trade-off we talked about earlier. You'll put up their tax rates, that will help with some problems, you have a more alignment across different incomes, but you are going to disincentivise investment. Now, and to take landlords as an example of that, one thing we already have in the system is a humongous tax bias in favour of owner-occupiers against landlords. For example, we cap their mortgage interest relief, we have higher stamp duty, and so on and so on. I could go through a whole list. Ultimately, what that means is that you are favouring owner-occupiers. Now, I think to a degree that's kind of far too big, but also in a way that's just, even if you want to do that, is a bit bizarre. But ultimately, by skewing the market in that way, you are going to make it bad. For those people who stay renters, you are making it fewer rental properties available and making higher rents. Now, if you're just talking about a small tax change, it's probably going to be a small effect. But I'm trying to point, it's in that class of trade-offs where another thing you could do is actually think about the tax base, think about how you treat landlords. For example, let them have full mortgage interest relief, think about some other things. That would allow you to raise tax rates with less damage to incentives. Again, it's sort of a plea to not only think about tax rates, but really think importantly about that definition of what is tax.
I think we're getting a very strong message, which I think would resonate with a lot of us, about looking at things in the round. Something happens over here has a consequence over here, and rather than picking up into the Scrabble bag, looking at it more roundly. And briefly on pensions, there's a lot of speculation of the last budget, and pensions obviously are, as we've talked about, some long-term, some short-term changes. They are very long-term products. And people will be saving into them. So do you think there's a prospect, have anyone got any particular expertise around pensions and the impact on behaviour? Obviously, taking out the lump sum was a big thing for the last election. But do you think there's an argument for changing the tax relief on pensions, equalising it at a, say, a 30% rate? I mean, Helen Miller, looks like you're nodding here.
Yeah, well, so we did a huge, like a 100-page report this a couple of years ago, so we thought really hard about this. So look, when we say big picture, it is an area of taxes where stability is really important. People are making very long-run decisions. It is very unhelpful to have constant speculation about what might happen because it really drives behaviour. So this is absolutely a part of this where I'd love to see the government kind of set out, here's what we think the tax system should be, and then just leave it alone for that stability purpose. I think the debate often moves towards the income tax relief for the upfront income. That's not a relief in my mind. I think you can make credible, reasonable, rational arguments whether you tax pensions on the way in or on the way out. You shouldn't be taxing them both ends. And what I hear people talk about capping the relief up front. Nobody simultaneously talks about, well, then in that case, reduce the tax on the way out. Yeah. So that's the thing. But the other thing we do have is that pensions are the largest form of remuneration that, for the most part, get no national insurance applied at any point, on the way in or the way out. And that's, to my mind, where we should be looking to think about how to get national insurance onto pensions. There's lots of complications there, but I think the easiest way to do it would be to put employer national insurance contributions on employer pension contributions. Right, okay. Or at the very least, to break the link between the subsidy to pensions and the employer national insurance contribution rate. So, for example, put full employer national insurance contributions on all employer contributions, so that it doesn't move with the rate, and have a separate relief that's kind of the relief you want, whatever subsidy you want to set for salary sacrifice, employer contributions, set that rate specifically rather than let it move. So for an employer, I'd do it at that end. For employee national insurance contributions, I think it would be most straightforward, just start applying those to pension income in receipt. But I think the subsidy really is about the NICS system and not the income tax system.
Yeah, thank you. And anyone else got any thoughts on this?
So I'd agree with that, and the very frequent calls we hear to limit tax relief on the way in, I think are not viable, because it's very hard or even impossible to apply them to defined benefit pensions. So if you end up with a system which essentially lets defined benefits off the hook and increases tax for defined contribution pensions,
Very unfair.
that seems
a few lucky
extremely
winners.
unfair.
I strongly agree with that.
And I think just as well as thinking about the, I end up in the same place, but as well as thinking about the theory of the tax system, I do think we have to think about who we think should pay more if what we need is more tax. And the generation currently of pensioners have seen, on average, living standards growth much faster than working age households, and kind of growth in wealth gaps between people in their 30s and people in their 60s. So that would point for a different reason to thinking more about national insurance or the income tax paid on the way out than on the way in.
Yeah, and so a couple of points on that is one around poorer people and pensions, and obviously with Curtis the Resolution Foundation looks very much at that, and there's a big inequality. A lower income, you're going to have a worse pension anyway. So do you think that then anything needs to be done in the tax system to help poorer people save more, but perhaps take it from wealthier pensioners or wealthier potential pensioners, future pensioners?
I mean, the main challenge that poor people have around saving is their level of income, not the tax incentive that they face. So I think fundamentally we have to look at how we boost the living standards of the poorer half of the population. There are actually quite complicated issues when you get into things like auto-enrolment and what the right rate is, that because replacement rates are based on your earnings, you can end up with almost over-saving for poorer households because the cost for them of not consuming now is higher. So I think it's a very important point. I don't think it's a straightforward issue, but one reason why I think you could justify the sort of either the tax switch or some employee national insurance on pensions is both of those would be done in a progressive way. So our tax switch, when you combine it with the triple lot, we now know will be £576 next year, I think. A pensioner would have to have income of more than £40,000 to lose out from the combination of those changes.
Okay, what about national insurance contributions on pensioners who are working? So 67 is the current retirement age, but some people are still working, quite a lot of people in this parliament actually, at 67. Do you think, but they don't have to pay, there's no national insurance contributions. Do you think that should be changed? Would that make a big difference?
So in principle, it's not clear to me why you would have different tax rates, different ages. In practice, I think there is quite a lot of evidence that people do become more sensitive to tax rates as they age. And so I would be quite cautious about changing it, given that boosting labour supply seems to be important at the moment.
What about smoothing it? I mean, maybe it's Helen Miller's question. So there's often protection periods when changes are brought into pensions. We've already seen for the public sector McLeod, which is a big change. How many times can you change a pension system in a generation, I suppose, is the question. But do you think there should be a smoothing if any of these changes were brought in so that people closer to retirement age weren't affected? Helen Miller.
I think it would really depend on exactly what you were doing. But I think, imagine if you had an end goal that says, yes, we want to apply something like full employer national insurance to upfront pensions, or you wanted to apply full national insurance to pensions in receipt, you wouldn't necessarily have to go the full way. Today, you could put a penny or 2 pennies on, or 2 percentage points today, and you could ratchet it up over time, for example. So that would be one form of transition. The other forms of transition, I think it really depends on what you're looking at doing. I mean, to give you one example, to your question earlier about poorer people in retirement, the lump sum, it's not lump sum now, but the 25% tax-free is an element that's particularly poorly targeted because it's more valuable to higher rate taxpayers. It's completely valueless to people who don't pay tax. So one thing we wrote about a couple of years ago was to say you could reform that in such a way that for a basic rate taxpayer it would be the same, but rather than have a tax-free element, you do have a top-up. So you make the top-up so that for the basic rate payer it's the same, but you basically reduce relief for the high rate taxpayers and you give some relief to the basic rate tax. That would be a recalibrating of that same amount of money away from the higher earners and towards non-taxpayers. If you were going to do that, you could think about not having it happen tomorrow. So again, I think the transition depends on what particular reform you're looking
A
at.
word of caution about doing it all too fast and too rapidly for that.
Yeah, but also you also don't want to let people think that it's coming in a couple of years' time and let them then do some massive planning and change their behaviour. So I think I think it really depends on what you're thinking about. I think you don't want to have people suddenly changing their retirement planning massively because they think something might happen in a couple of years.